The legendary Pelé scored his first goal against North American Soccer League competition right here on the CBS Sports Spectacular. Since then, the sports superstar has demonstrated his wizardry to league record audiences, transforming an international game into an American spectacle. And today, you'll see him lead the New York Kosmos against the Seattle Sounders. Today on the CBS Sports Spectacular, a North American Soccer League match from Seattle, Washington. The New York Kosmos versus the Seattle Sounders. Welcome to dynamic Seattle, Washington, in the heart of the Pacific Northwest. And the Seattle Center in 1962 site of the World's Fair, the famous Space Needle. And now, home of the Seattle Sounders of the North American Soccer League. Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Lieber, and this is Bedlam. 18,000 standing room only at Memorial Stadium here in Seattle, Washington, for the North American Soccer League match between the New York Kosmos and their superstar Pelé and the Seattle Sounders. Both teams leading their respective divisions in the NASL. New York on top of the North, Seattle in the West. It should be a great match.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello there, everybody. How are you? My name is Tim Hanlon, and this is Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. Yeah, believe it or not, that's what we do here each and every week. We delve into things about teams and leagues no longer in existence or previously incarnated, he says. It's a fascinating journey that we're on. We've been doing this for, over a year and a half, and all kinds of stories and interesting things that become known to us in our little investigations. And this week is a special treat. As we go back into the realm of soccer, North American Soccer League style, the original NASL. And our guest this week is Dave Brett Wasser, and that's a name that many of you soccer enthusiasts out there probably should know, in that he is, by all accounts, the king of North American Soccer League game footage. Out there, even more so than the vaunted and newly launched National Soccer Hall of Fame in Frisco, Texas. Dave has for years been collecting and archiving just about all of the game footage that exists out there in the world from the old North American Soccer League. He's got other stuff too, but there is nobody on this planet who has more knowledge of and or direct game footage of the old North American Soccer League. And as you'll hear in our conversation, dating back as early as 1973 and pretty much consistently just about every year thereafter until the demise of the league in late 1984, chances are that if it exists on Earth, a game of the North American Soccer League, it's in Dave's collection, and he has been the go-to for lots of folks, both in the television and production side, players, family members of former players looking for footage. Hell, even the National Soccer Hall of Fame itself, although as we'll hear in our chat with Dave coming up, not necessarily the most fuzzy and warm relationship, strangely, amongst the two. And you'd think, as we'll get into in our chat, the best and most natural place, I think, for all of this footage to live and breathe and be accessible is probably through the auspices of something like the National Soccer Hall of Fame. But we'll get into some of the reasons why that is not quite yet the case, and perhaps maybe some reasons for hope that it will become so. But until then, all of this great footage, some of which is available now on YouTube, and we'll get to some of the reasons why Dave has sort of kind of taken down his list of all of his available stuff because of that. But largely, the collection of his remains with him in his home in Austin, Texas. And if you really want some good background, even before listening to this episode, I highly encourage you to check out a column by longtime soccer writer Pablo Maurer for The Athletic, which is a great site. It's arguably the new Sports Illustrated, if you will, or probably the best sort of source of sports journalism out there. It's well worth subscribing to for this article alone that Pablo wrote back in November. And the title of that is called How the Largest American Soccer Film Archive Came to Live in a Guest Room in Austin, Texas. And that guest room is indeed owned by our guest this week, Dave Brett Wasser. And I think you're going to find this really, really interesting. And Dave's a treasure trove of knowledge about this league and is a testament, frankly, to how memorable some of these games and some of the people who inhabited these games were in his and a lot of other people's memories, and a testament to his passion for trying to essentially collect the best documentation he could of this league. And we'll get into that, as well as what the future of that trove of memories will be going forward. Coming up in a couple of seconds with our guest, Dave Brett Wasser, here on The Big Show. I want to remind you that we've got a bunch of great sponsors. You've heard me tout all of them for many, many weeks, but I'm going to just rattle them off to you, especially as the holidays approach. If you're looking for some great gift ideas for that sort of sports enthusiast, especially that who is interested in the history of sports, especially for, of course, our specialty, teams and leagues that are previously incarnated or for whatever reason no longer with us, defunct and just, RIP. And these are some three great places that you can go to sort of indulge either your or perhaps the interests of some of your loved ones or friends who might be interested in remembering some of those things. And sportshistorycollectibles.com, if you want to find great items and memorabilia, if by all means go there early and often, some great stuff there. Use the promo code at sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code Good Seats, and you're going to get 15% off all your purchases there. We thank Dean Mitchell and friends there. We thank our friends at 503 Sports, and they're the king of throwbacks. If you want sort of not only great shirts of teams and leagues no longer with us, but also some handcrafted, small batch created uniforms, throwback uniforms of some of the great teams and leagues no longer with us, especially in the realm of professional football, like the old WFL and the World League of American Football and the XFL, et cetera, World Football League. That is at 503-sports.com. Make sure you use the promo code there, and that's SEATS, and you're going to get 10% off all of your purchases there. And, of course, oldschoolshirts.com, where you're probably going to find the best array of high-quality logo-branded T-shirts, not only of great teams and leagues no longer with us, but also of great memories from things like shopping malls and radio station logos and other amusement parks, all these kinds of things from your past memories. They are waiting for you to be remembered and purchased and worn from your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, and you want to use the promo code there. That's also Good Seats, and you're going to get 10% off all your purchases there. So make sure you check out all of those sites. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code Good Seats, oldschoolshirts.com, promo code Good Seats, or 503-sports.com. Use the promo code SEATS there. And all those places are worth your time, and we appreciate all of them for being sponsors of this show. And we thank you for all of you who have partaken of their great stuff. We appreciate all your commentary and all your good wishes, and we thank you for patronizing these sites as well. And you keep our lights on too by doing so. We greatly appreciate that, of course. All right, so we greatly appreciate you continuing to listen to our very fun conversation with the great Dave Brett Wasser of Austin, Texas fame. And we're going to get into this amazing, one-of-a-kind collection of North American Soccer League game footage that he has collected over the years, and the rationale and the passion behind it, and some interesting stories about what's come of it and maybe what happens to it in the months and years ahead. And here's our conversation with Dave that we had just a couple of days ago.
I grew up in New York City in the 1970s, and I was a fan of all sports. It wasn't just soccer. I was a fan of my grandfather was a huge baseball fan, so he would take me to Yankees and Mets games. I loved the Jets and the Giants. I loved the New York Rangers and the Kosmos as well. I became a bigger soccer fan as an adult. I think when I was growing up, I like soccer equally well along with the other sports. Now I'm primarily a soccer fan. And, I grew up watching the Kosmos on WOR-TV, Channel 9, as I'm sure you did as well, because you were in the New York metropolitan area.
Absolutely.
And, the voice of Jim Carvelis and Seamus Mallon calling the Kosmos games. And I used to love the way the games always started with Jim Carvelis saying, "This is Kosmos soccer." The amazing thing, one of the many ways that soccer is so different now than it was back then is that for us growing up, the Kosmos were the only soccer on TV. That was it. There was, I wasn't even aware that the U.S. national soccer team existed in those days because it was never on television. I don't recall ever seeing any news about it, or international soccer was barely on TV. There was a show on PBS called Soccer Made in Germany, which I only became aware of years later. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. And I probably wouldn't even have watched it at that time because I wasn't interested in what was going on the other side of the world. So the Kosmos were it. I don't even think I watched a soccer game featuring a team other than the Kosmos until around 1986, after the Kosmos were gone. Now of course we have so many choices, and that's a problem for MLS because MLS has to compete with all the other leagues. One of the real advantages the NASL had is that they were the only game in town, the only soccer game. I didn't go to many soccer games because my parents weren't into it. The Kosmos played out at the Meadowlands, and I had no way of getting out there with my friends. I grew up in Manhattan. I think I went to one Kosmos game at the Meadowlands in those days. I think it was in 1979. For me, my story is I grew up watching sports and loving sports, and in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then sometime around the early 90s, I started to get nostalgic for the games and the players that I had watched growing up. And I wanted to see those games. I had an emotional attachment to those games. Now, I recognize that I have a different way of looking at this than many people and many sports fans. Many people don't really care about what happened in the past. Henry Ford famously said, "History is bunk." He didn't care. He said, "I don't care what happened before. I care about what's happening now." Well, I care about what's happening now, too. In fact, I care about what's happening now even more than what happened in the past. But I have an emotional attachment to certain things from the past. And I wanted to see the games that I had watched. Unfortunately, the games, the original broadcasts of the games were not, and are not commercially available. You can walk into a movie store and buy a copy of a movie that you watched in 1977, but you can't walk into a video store and buy a copy of a game you watched back then. So I was curious to know whether anybody had actually recorded these games. My family didn't have a VCR until the early 1980s, and in those days, blank videotapes were expensive, so I didn't record a single soccer game. I think the first soccer game I recorded was, in the early 90s. But I was curious to know whether anybody had. And before I started this detective work to track down all these old NASL videos, I thought if I'm lucky, I'll find maybe 10 or 20 videos of Kosmos games. I ended up finding about 75. And in fact, I've ended up finding about 400 videos of NASL games, which is still surprising to me. Considering how expensive VCRs were and how expensive videotape was, yet there were a few people who really, religiously recorded these games. The trick to finding the old games, a lot of former players had collections of old tapes. because not that the players themselves recorded the games, but a lot of players had a family member who anticipated that someday, years later, that their relative would want to watch tapes of games that they played in. So a lot of players had like an uncle or somebody who recorded games. That's how I ended up getting a lot of copies of games from former players. The league itself, the NASL itself, had a huge storage of old games, which were distributed when the league folded in early 1985. Those tapes were distributed to various players and coaches. You know, the league office they had to empty all the contents of the league office. They didn't want to throw the tapes away, so they started calling around people and saying, "Hey, we've got tapes of a bunch of games that you may be in. Would you like them?" And the league office then sent out those tapes were actually on an older format known as U-matic, which is an hour-long video format. It's actually a bigger and bulkier tape. And the irony is that a lot of the players that I found had these U-matic tapes that they either got from the team or the league, the team they played on, or the league itself, and they didn't even have any equipment to play them on. I bought a used U-matic machine years ago, and I said to people, well, if you send me your U-matic tapes, I'll copy them, I'll transfer them to videotape or years later to DVD, and I'll send them back to you along with copies. And that was how I acquired a lot of these tapes. It's remarkable when you think about it. By the way, I also collect videos of the other sports I love. Like I have about several hundred videos of old NFL games. But I never listed those on the website because I didn't want to incur the wrath of the National Football League. I also have a lot of old baseball games as well. Now, Tim, do you collect videos of these games?
Well, you say that because over the years, I have parted with a number of checks you may not remember, but.
I forget. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Thank you.
I have collected a number of. Some of them I still have on tape, and some of them I have on DVD. But no, I've been a regular. A junkie, shall we say?
Now, did I send you just soccer games, or did I send you videos of other sports as well?
No,
I don't even remember.
I think it was just soccer games. But I mean, to me,
okay.
I too was fascinated by, and to me. Growing up as a kid in northern New Jersey, I was a little easier to get to games and stuff, and we had season tickets for the Kosmos. That was truly an amazing, amazing time, and only made more important and indelible as the years went on, because you sort of see all the the rise today of how much money is in the game and the super teams like the Chelseas of 5-6 years ago. The Kosmos, right, were a gigantic, big, white, hot comet of excitement on the world stage. It was a New York phenomenon. It was a global soccer phenomenon. It was, Andy Warhol was again. It was this craziness. I know. Right, and to not get wrapped up in that, right?
But here's the thing. I've come around on this. I used to think the Kosmos were good for American soccer. I've now come to the view that they were actually bad for American soccer. Here's why. There was such a competitive imbalance. It wasn't good for the game to have one team so dominant year after year. Between 1977 and 1982, the Kosmos won 4 of 6 championships between those years. It's still, one of the greatest upsets in NASL history was when the Whitecaps knocked the Kosmos out of the semifinal in 1979. And I still consider that, by the way, the greatest game in NASL history. We can talk about that later. Having all those stars on one team, I don't think it was really good for the league. I think a lot of fans in a lot of cities kind of looked at this and said, well, what chance does our team have? It was good for New York, but was it good for the league as a whole? I don't think it was. Do you agree with me, or do you disagree with me on that?
Well, it's a good question. I'm not sure, and it's hard for me to separate my how I became hooked on the game. Obviously, going to games, but also I was playing, which was a fair rarity. Although in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area was probably easier than most places in the United States in the early mid 1970s as a kid. Having good soccer programs and coaches and people into the game. But, in 1976, Bobby Smith and Bob Rigby, right, of the New York Cosmos, right, came to my town to hand out our soccer trophies for the season, right? And, what's this Cosmos thing all about? They play in Yankee Stadium and then, then the next year they're playing at Giant Stadium, which is literally, a hop, skip, and a jump from my house. So, but I think you're right. But I also think, without them, you wonder, and maybe I could sort of segue into, sort of the history of the North American Soccer League. We've delved into that a little bit on the show, with both direct and indirect participants, shall we say. I remember vividly in 1978 or 79, the New York Daily News, back when it was, actually worth reading, actually had a counterpoint on whether to break up the Kosmos. And I think yes was, I don't know who it was, some cynic. And then no, it was Phil Woosnam, right, the commissioner of the North American Soccer League, saying, this is the greatest thing. And I think through his eyes, right, this was by any means necessary, especially given the North American Soccer League's near-death experience, merely 5 or 6 years prior. That this was a worldwide marketing calling card, right, for the sport of soccer, the United States breaking through. And I guess, kind of what by any means necessary to sort of get that across the transom of the American sports landscape.
Yeah, no. Phil Wilson himself, in interviews later in life, said that his biggest mistake in life was not instituting a salary cap in the NASL. So he recognized years later what a mistake that was. With a salary cap, there wouldn't have been any star-studded New York Cosmos. Look, it's easy for him to say that in retrospect because of what happened to the league, but yeah, I think if the MLS learned one lesson from the NASL, it was the need for a salary cap. Of course, if the NASL had put in a salary cap in the late 1970s, they would have been the first league to do so. I mean, no league had ever tried anything like that. But it would have helped. I think, it would have broken up the Kosmos. It would have helped the league as a whole.
Well, it also speaks to, and we've delved in this topic a bit on the show, just not soccer specifically only, but other sports too, is this idea of, do you like Major League Soccer, maybe to its credit, although it's getting a little long in the tooth now, central ownership, right, versus the franchise model, right? And there's make no mistake, right? And we've talked to Clive Toy about this, for example, the idea of franchises, right? Phil Woosnam saw the money, right? There were people in 1977-ish who kind of said, we'll buy franchises. And that's why they went from, 16 to 24 teams, I think, in the span of 1 year, 18 to 24 teams. Right, and people like Toy would say, half of them probably shouldn't have been there in the first place yet. Very alluring when you have a franchise model. So I don't know. Again, by any means necessary, right? I guess is, through the lens of history. Yeah.
And look, some of these underfunded teams would have done fine if the market had just taken off and the fans had packed the stadiums. Then nobody would have known that the owners really didn't have very deep pockets. It was only because in many cases the team struggled, and then it became clear that these guys couldn't withstand years of losses. But look, MLS has had years of losses, but they have owners who could afford that. Another thing when you look back at the NASL, not only was there a problem with the competitive imbalance, but just the stadiums they were playing in were often terrible for soccer. And that was a problem for MLS in the first 10 years. Remember, in the early years of MLS, they were often playing on stadiums which had American football grid lines. Now you almost never see that in MLS. But, you look at, I think maybe half of the tapes in my collection are games played either on American football grid lines or even worse, over a baseball field. And the stadiums were way too large. Not in the case of the Kosmos. Kosmos and Tampa did very well. Tampa's stadium was often filled. Minnesota did very well. So a few markets, the stadium was the right size, but overall, a lot of these markets, they should have been playing in smaller stadiums, but the ownership in those days couldn't possibly afford to build their own stadiums. That wasn't even an option. They had to play in these large, gigantic football stadiums and baseball stadiums, and they paid a big price for it. Although that wasn't part of the consciousness at the time. It wasn't until years later that people started thinking about getting the sport of soccer into the right kind of stadium. I don't remember in the 70s or 80s anyone talking about stadiums and how to get, because I suppose because at the time building a new stadium wasn't a possibility. So it was you just took what you could get. But that hurt the NASL tremendously. You know, and I mean, we could go on and on about all the different problems the NASL had, but let's stay positive. Let's talk about the good things in the league.
Well, yeah, let's rewind. Let's rewind. So, at what point, you know, when you decided that, hey, you know, there's got to be some evidence, some you know, tapes of some of the games that I remember floating around out there. At what point in your journey did it sort of go from sort of a curiosity to, I can't think of a better word, obsession?
Good question. I guess I went to graduate school for philosophy in the late 90s. And then in 1999, I got my master's degree, and I kind of shifted from philosophy to this. And, you know, it did become an obsession. It just became, I was just, you know, curious. I'd read about a game, and I'd think, oh, man, I wonder if that's out there. And in some cases, you know, the tape was out there. I mean, I'm astounded to find some of the things I've had. A few of the games I've never found. You know, there's a famous game that played in 1977 when the Kosmos, I think, sold out Giant Stadium for the first time. It was a playoff game against Fort Lauderdale. Never found a tape of that game. That game, by the way, also was not in the Kosmos archive, the archive that Pepe Pinton maintained for years. Pepe Pinton, of course, is the person who he was the last employee of the Kosmos in 1985, and so he got the video archive. And then years later, he sold it to the new people who bought the Kosmos. And so that video archive has now gone through several different ownership. But yeah, the 77 playoff game against Fort Lauderdale was known as the 77,000 game. And yeah, I've never found that, unfortunately. That game, by the way, here's a funny story about that game. Ron Newman, sadly, who just passed away a few months ago, was the coach of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, and he always maintained that the Pony Shoe Company helped the Kosmos win that game. The Pony Shoe Company, the Kosmos had some kind of advertising deal with Pony Shoe Company, and then the Kosmos players appeared in Pony ads. And he says that the Pony Shoe Company gave the Kosmos a better cleat for that game because the AstroTurf at Giant Stadium was wet and slick. It had been raining all day, and the Pony Shoe Company gave the Kosmos a cleat that was designed for a slick AstroTurf. He always says that the fix was in on that game. Who knows? Well, I'd have to see that game to see. That's another reason why I'd love to find the tape of that game to see were the Strikers players slipping on the field more than the Kosmos players. Who knows? Do you know, Tim? Do you remember that game? Did you watch that game on TV? Or
Yeah,
were you at that? Were you at that game?
No, I was ensconced away at Boy Scout camp in northern. The state of New York in pouring rain, and it was a sore subject because my parents, of course, dutifully mailed the program to me the next day. What a great game it was! But I went to the other games before they ultimately won the championship. But I do remember some of the footage, right? The Kosmos did a very good job of recording, I guess, sideline camera stuff, right? That was not broadcast. Yeah. Right.
Right. Yeah, there was one guy, a filmmaker whose name escapes me right now. Oh, who was he had access. He had access to the sidelines, and he would often stand behind the goal. And he was the one who made the annual Kosmos highlight films, and so a lot of the goals in those highlight films were shot from his camera. I think he was the one holding the camera from behind the goal. And so in the 77 Kosmos highlight film, you see highlights of that Strikers Kosmos playoff game, and you can see the Kosmos goals. But you know, it'd be nice to see the whole game. I'm the kind of guy. Highlights are okay, but I want to see the whole game. I want to see. To me, like the highlights are far more interesting in the context of the game itself. You know, just seeing somebody score a goal or seeing somebody score a touchdown is far less interesting than to see how that play developed. You know.
To me, you know, I think maybe a lot of our listeners, especially those who grew up or remember the NASL, probably have their own sort of games and memories, and some of them obviously have been dutifully found and recorded and maybe shared from you. But you know, to me, my personal holy grail is 1978. The Kosmos were in a 2-game series, which was obviously then with a mini game.
It's Minnesota. Yeah,
Minnesota Kicks,
Oh.
right. And they got pasted 9-2 at Minnesota, the Kosmos did, and then they came back and won the regular game and then the mini game plus shootout, right, which was actually a bit of a precursor to the 79 game you referenced earlier. But WOR certainly covered that first game. I know that. I haven't seen that out there. And then
I have the first half of that game. I found a recording of the first half of the game, and unfortunately, the guy. It was such a bad game that he just recorded over the second half. I can tell you the first half if you like to see it. The Minnesota Kicks were leading 3-0 at halftime. I don't think I ever put that first half of the game on the website because I thought, well, people aren't going to just want to watch the first half. They're going to want to watch the whole thing. But I've never found a tape of the return game in New York, and that was the much better game. Yeah, that was an incredible series. I don't know. We can take a diversion here. I have never been a fan of the 2-game series format in soccer. And I know I just read a few days ago that apparently MLS is planning on dropping the 2-game format in the playoffs. They're moving towards a single elimination playoff, which I think is probably better for the league. How do you feel about that? Do you prefer a 2-game series or a single game?
Well, I don't know. I think, I kind of like the excitement of having, 2 sort of home games, I guess. But the aggregate goal thing gets a little confusing, arguably.
It really does. It's very confusing.
But I do think perhaps that could be something that would make the regular season a little bit more important, right? Is that a home field advantage for the 1 game kind of thing?
Right. Right. There's no home field advantage in a 2-game series. I mean, they try to pretend that there is, but of course there isn't. In a single elimination game, there would be a home field advantage. Yeah. The problem I have with the 2-game series, especially when it's an aggregate goal series, is that if the first game is close, then that game tends to be just anticlimactic. It's a close game. Well, everyone leaves thinking, all right, well, this will be decided in the second game. If the first game is a blowout, then the second game becomes meaningless. So it almost like either way, one of those 2 games is not going to matter. Of course, in the NASL, it was an aggregate goal. It wasn't that way. It was so even if the Kosmos got blown out 9-2 in the first game, they could still come back and win the series by winning the second game and then winning the mini game. In fact, I talked to Alan Willey. When Alan Willey got inducted to the National Soccer Hall of Fame, I asked him, he was the striker on the Minnesota Kicks, and I asked him about that game. And I said, what was the attitude in the locker room after the Kicks lost that second game and the mini game in New York? And he said it was just devastating. He said he'd never seen players look so despondent. And he said they were angry because they felt that, if only this had been aggregate goal rather than, then they would have been on top by aggregate goals, but that wasn't the format. So, that was, they came so close in that game. Looking back on it, again, it would have been better for soccer in America if Minnesota had won that game. Because I think that was around the time people just started getting sick of watching the Kosmos constantly win everything. So, I was rooting for the Kosmos in that game, but in retrospect, I wish Minnesota had won.
Well, before the Kosmos, and maybe aside from them, give us a sense of where you sort of found all these games, how far back you were able to go, and maybe some of the networks or the stations that sort of stood out as either good broadcasters and producers of these games and/or treasure troves that you might have stumbled across.
Well, the earliest recordings that I have from home VCRs are from 1978. The Sony Betamax machine was commercially available in 1977. And then I found this man in Illinois, an elderly man in Illinois, who started recording soccer games in 1978. And he had not only did he have a VCR before almost anybody did in 78, but he also had a satellite dish. So he was able to get out of market games. He was able to get, broadcasts that were nowhere near Illinois through the satellite dish. And I got 2 of the great playoff games from 1978. There's a Strikers, I think Detroit Express game between the Detroit Express and Strikers. It's a wonderful game that I got from him. Prior to 1978, video recording technology was invented, I believe, in the late 1950s. The earliest, here's a little trivia for your listeners, the earliest known recording of a videotape recording is of the kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev in That was when Richard Nixon was vice president, I think in 58 or 59. I have that, by the way, and it still looks pretty good over these years later. And in the 1960s and 70s, up until 1977, video recording equipment was in professional settings. It was in television studios. It was in, the networks had video recording. And the three networks, ABC was the best at recording. Roone Arledge was very much, had the foresight to know that tapes of these games would be useful years later. And so he had ABC record every Monday Night Football game, and most of the sports that appeared on ABC in the 1970s was recorded by ABC. CBS recorded some things and not others. NBC, by the way, was the worst. NBC recorded very little, and that's why NBC had the American Football Conference in the 1970s, and many of the great AFC playoff games of the 1970s featuring the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Oakland Raiders are lost to history because NBC did not record them, whereas some of the NFC playoff games from the 1970s are available because CBS recorded them. But getting back to soccer, I found, sometimes it's not even possible to tell where the tape came from. There was a regional sports network known as TVS in the 1970s, and I guess TVS itself recorded a bunch of their broadcasts of games, and who knows, wherever I got them from, just got them from somebody, and who knows how it ended up in my hands, but it did. I'm surprised. For example, one of the earliest NASL game I have is the 1973 championship game played in Texas Stadium between the Philadelphia Adams and the Dallas Tornado. This was, by the way, Kyle Rote Jr.'s rookie season. He was the rookie of the year that year. And the Philadelphia Adams were an expansion team, one of the only expansion teams in professional sports history that won a championship in their first year. And that's amazing. Again, I found that game was recorded on pneumatic tape, so it was on two tapes, and the tapes got separated. I found one half of that game at the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in Waco. They had it in their archive. I just called up the curator of that museum and said, I live here in Austin. I'm an hour south of you. Do you happen to have any NASL games? And he said, oh yeah, we do. We've got half of a game from 1973. And so I said, oh, great. I'd love to see it. And then I don't remember even where the other half came from. It's almost, it's hard to know how these tapes ended up in some of the people who ended up owning them. And of course, now, I know you want to probably curious to know why I closed down my website. I started my website, as I said, I'd gone out of graduate school in 1999, and then I think it started the website shortly after I left graduate school, where I listed all the tapes that I had. And I ended up closing it down last year because so many of the games are now on YouTube. Most of the NASL games in my collection are on YouTube, and so I feel if people can just watch them there, they don't need to get them from me. And there's a sort of a placeholder on my website which just says that, look, I felt that at this point that my archive has become kind of obsolete. Now, unfortunately, many of the games in my collection are not on YouTube, and those games just are not going to be available. But I still copy games for people if they really want to see an old game. But at this point, I feel like YouTube has kind of made my collection obsolete.
Well, look, I don't know about that, right? I mean, so you've got people like myself, right, who kind of delve back into, and I think, what I've discovered in this little journey is that, there are a lot of great memories, especially, and, you look at, say, Major League Soccer and the sort of, I'm going to call it whitewash per se. I mean, there are teams that did borrow names from the old NASL, like the Timbers and the Sounders, et cetera. But, this is sort of an arm's length relationship, if any, with the past, the MLS does.
Oh, sure. Oh, no question about that. But look, when MLS started in 1996, they made a conscious decision to distance themselves from soccer's past. And I understand why. I mean, at the time, I resented that decision, but I understand why. They don't want to be associated with what many people regard as a failure. Of course, the NASL, it's too simplistic to say that the NASL was a failure. The NASL was both a success and a failure. It was a success for a number of years, and then it was a failure at the end. Look, the American people in the early 1980s just lost interest in soccer. And I'm not even sure that was the NASL's fault. It's hard to. I've had this discussion, by the way, with many soccer fans over the years, and people who are alive and remember the early 1980s. And I've asked them, why did people stop watching soccer in the early 1980s? And there's never been any really clear answer. Nobody is really quite sure. It was sort of a cultural trend, cultural shift away from the sport of soccer. Look, eventually it came back. And I think the single most important event in the history of soccer in this country was the 1994 World Cup. That was what created so many new soccer fans, and that was what brought a lot of people back to the game. A lot of people who had just very little interest suddenly took interest when the World Cup came here, and that's why it's so important that the World Cup is coming back into 2026, because hosting the World Cup brings a new level of attention to the game. But in the early 80s, it was just such a struggle. I mean, on a social level, I remember like the late 70s up until like 81 or 82, I remember like my friends were always talking about soccer. And then like my friends stopped talking about it around like 82, 83. And so I stopped caring about it, because you tend to care about what the people around you care about. And, even I sort of lost interest in soccer between around 83 and 1990. I kind of barely watched a game. Of course, back in those days, there wasn't much soccer on television. I mean, the only soccer on television was indoor soccer. And then when the USA qualified for the World Cup in 1990, that kind of brought me back. Although here's the thing, I couldn't watch the USA games, the 1990 World Cup, because they were on a cable network that was not on my cable system in those days.
TNT. Turner.
Yeah, that's right. Turner. TNT was not on Arlington cable, and so I could not watch the games, unfortunately. The world has changed quite a bit, even since 1990.
Going back to your trove here for a second. So what would you sort of consider your most prized possession, like the one that sort of was like, the coup de grace, so to speak, like the holy grail that you found? And frankly, what about the ones that have eluded you, whether they don't exist or you just didn't find them?
I think my favorite game is that 1979 semifinal game I mentioned between the Kosmos and the Vancouver Whitecaps. Vancouver Whitecaps, of course, had a very different identity. The Kosmos were international. They had players from South America. They had players from Germany and Holland, and the Whitecaps were largely English. They had most of their team were were players who had played in the English First Division. They even had a couple of guys, I think, who were on the 1966 World Cup winning team for England. I think Alan Ball from the 1966 England team was on that Whitecaps team. And it was a 2-game series. The first game was in Vancouver, and Vancouver won. They won 2-0, and the second goal, I think, was disputed because the Kosmos thought that the Vancouver player was offside. The replay showed he was not offside. And I think a Kosmos player actually got Carlos Alberto got red carded at the end of the first game, so he wasn't even in the second game, protesting, I think, that offsides call, the non-offsides call. And then the second game, I remember watching it. It was on ABC. 1979 was the year. ABC, by the way, had a 3-year contract to show the NASL, 79, 80, and 81. The ratings were poor in 1980, and so ABC didn't even show any games in 1981. I think the only game ABC showed in 81 was the Soccer Bowl. But the 70
at that, by the way.
That's right. Oh, that's right. Oh. And tape delayed in Chicago. The 81 Soccer Bowl was in the Chicago Sting on the Cosmos. The Sting won in the shootout at the end. And here's a funny story about one of my favorite people from soccer in those days is Lee Stern, the man who owned the Chicago Sting. I called him up and said, Lee, I love soccer. I collect these videos. I'm going to be in Chicago. And he said, oh, come by my office. Come in. And I said, oh, great. I come into his office, and he starts showing me all this memorabilia from the Sting days and shows me old news clippings. And I mean, he's such a nice man. And I asked him about that 1981 Soccer Bowl, and he, oh, my God, it's like his face turned red. He said they didn't show it live because they were showing a rerun of The Love Boat. Oh, and he years later, he was still angry that the ABC affiliate in Chicago thought a rerun of The Love Boat was more important than showing the soccer bowl. So the soccer bowl, I think, was shown in Chicago starting at like midnight, so it didn't end until like well after 2 a.m. or I think that's what it was. So yeah, I mean, one of the many struggles and frustrations of soccer fans in those days. But getting back to the game, what you asked about that '79 game, so the second game was in New York. It was on ABC. It was on ABC on a Saturday afternoon. It was a real back and forth affair. Ricky Davis was playing in that game. That was his rookie season. That was special because he was an American. He was the best American player at that time. Beckenbauer was in that game. Of course, Ganalia. And I think it was just, the Kosmos seemed invincible in those days. Just everyone, including me, just thought, okay, well, they'll find a way to win. And they won the second game. So now the series was even, and it went to the mini game. And then it went to the shootout at the end of the mini game, and the Whitecaps won the shootout. And I remember just sitting there in stunned silence, like how is it possible the Kosmos are not going to win again? That to me, I mean, that just the sheer drama of that game and how it went to the mini game and how it was on ABC. And it was that to me was the greatest NASL game. And that was that man in Illinois who had recorded that game. So I was. When a package arrived in the mail from him and it said 79 Whitecaps Kosmos, I said, "Ooh, I found it."
And I was at that game I was at, right? And to be able to watch,
were you?
To be able to see that through the prism of the actual broadcast, right? When I was in the stands, right, I did not see in the beginning of that game the little vignette that Jim McKay did. He hosted at the beginning at the top of the broadcast, right? He had Ahmet Erdogan from the Kosmos arguing still that red card and Phil Woosnam defending the decision. And it almost looked like it came to blows before the game even started in the booth. And that was fascinating. And Vern Lundquist, getting flummoxed by various calls made or not made, and offsides call, whatever, and he couldn't get the answer from the linesman and stuff. And you could see that Vern was, perturbed by sort of the lack of information that he was frankly not being given. And Jim McKay trying to say, "You stay on the case, Vern." I mean, it was a quintessential, like almost a microcosm, I guess, of the league itself, all in one 3+ hour package.
Right. And there was a disputed goal in that game as well. There was a ball that hit a Whitecap shot that hit the underside of the Kosmos crossbar and then went straight down. And I remember they're showing it on replay saying, well, is the whole ball past the line? Well, it was not called a goal. I think that was probably the right call. But there was, so it even had there was even a dispute in that one. That was an amazing game. And, you can look back and think about what might have been. I mean, you always wonder if more people had been watching that game, would they have become soccer fans? Who knows?
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel it anytime. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now back to our conversation. You mentioned 1973 as kind of your earliest, right? So I always dreamt of being able to find some footage from 1967 and 1968, right? Which is when CBS, went all in on both of the, the National Professional Soccer League and then the NASL in 1968. And Jack Whitaker was on those broadcasts, and Danny Blanchflower was on those broadcasts. I read about it. I see some various interesting articles about, and some shenanigans, apparently. Some of the referees, maybe faking some injuries or calls so that the insertion of commercials could have been done. And I'm sure these games are all lost to history, but you wonder if CBS in the archive somewhere might have an old copy of some of that. Mary Machado game, those kinds of things.
Again, CBS was not the best at recording games, and I can tell you, if it were in the CBS archive, it would have surfaced. Now, one game from 1968 has surfaced, and it was with Danny Blanchflower. It was an exhibition game between the Oakland Clippers and Dynamo Kiev, played in Oakland. But I don't even count that as an NASL game because it was an exhibition, and I think it was after the Clippers had already left the league. They had some kind of dispute with the league, and so they had decided to go independent, and then that was why they were playing these international games. But I can send that to you. I haven't sent you that one. That will be in the mail tomorrow morning if you like.
Well, let me. So let's go back to that. So I can't imagine I am the only one that still is interested in this stuff, and or doesn't necessarily think all the best stuff is out there on YouTube. So I guess my only question to you would be, why wouldn't you put the games that you have back up on site and at least allow people who either can't find the games on YouTube or maybe have some? I mean, why not keep it up there and alive, especially given how the sport of soccer seems to become much more mainstream now. I think, frankly, this is my perception, right? There are more people who actually become curious about this sort of ragtag sketched history of the game that prior to MLS. I think the more MLS lasts, right? More people kind of get curious about what came before.
Yeah, there certainly are some people curious about it. I just don't know whether sending out physical media, sending out DVDs is really the way to go in the future. I mean, nowadays it's all about streaming. Look, if I had the time, what I would do is just upload all of the games from my collection that are not on YouTube onto YouTube. That would be simpler than sending out all these physical discs. It's just a matter of time. And the truth is, at this point in my life, I've gone on to other things. Look, people ask me a lot of times what's going to become of your collection, and I always say, look, I would donate the whole collection to the Soccer Hall of Fame if they had a real plan for doing something useful with the collection. I mean, if the Soccer Hall of Fame wanted to hire somebody or have an intern to take all the DVDs and upload them onto the Soccer Hall of Fame's website, then people could go to the Hall of Fame's website and watch the games there or, on YouTube. But from what I understand, the Hall of Fame just isn't doing that. They're doing other things. I mean, especially in the last few years, they've been focused entirely on getting the museum up and running in Frisco. And by the way, I went to the Soccer Hall of Fame. I went to the opening weekend, and the museum is terrific. I really hope people make a pilgrimage there because the museum is actually better than the museum was in Oneonta. They've used a lot of new technologies that are really exciting and fun. If the Hall of Fame came to me and said, look, we've got a plan for utilizing your archive, I would say, sure, here, have them at this point. But I haven't heard from them. Look, I'd love to see these games on ESPN Classic. There's a story. At several points over the last 18 years, I've contacted ESPN Classic and told them, look, you can have my collection. I wouldn't have given them the original masters. I would have made copies for them. And most of the NASL games at this point are in the public domain, except for the trademark of the New York Kosmos. Most of the trademarks have now expired. You could show these games in some cases the games are what are known as orphan works, which means that it's either the game is in the public domain or it's not clear who the copyright holder is. And ESPN Classic could just show orphan works, and if anybody ever complained, they could take it down and say, look, we didn't know who owned this. But here's the thing. The program directors of ESPN Classic are not soccer fans. The last time I checked, it was the program director was some 30-year-old kid who had no interest in soccer whatsoever. I remember having a conversation with him over the phone, and I said to him, well, the MLS has teams now that are using the NASL names, like the Seattle Sounders. He said he'd never heard of the Seattle Sounders. He had no interest in MLS, no interest in historic soccer. This is the programming director of ESPN should be somebody like our age or older who watched these games growing up and who has members which games mattered to people at the time they originally aired. That's the person who should be in charge of programming at ESPN Classic. ESPN. I've talked to employees at ESPN, and they say that, well, ESPN Classic is just this kind of thing that nobody really cares about. It's just this afterthought. By the way, I tried to reach John Skipper. John Skipper for many years was the person running ESPN. He was a real soccer fan and did a lot to help promote the game in this country by getting soccer onto ESPN. I wrote him letters. I called his office. He wouldn't take or return my phone calls. He wouldn't respond to my letters. The programming director is not somebody who cares about soccer, and the people above the programming director, ESPN, are unreachable. So that's why soccer is not on ESPN Classic. But by the way, somebody at MLS told me that MLS has tried to get the early MLS Cups on ESPN Classic, and again, it was met with the same resistance. Remember, I don't know if you remember, the first MLS Cup was between DC United and LA Galaxy, played in a rainstorm, and that was a wonderful game. ESPN Classic was not interested in showing it, so it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and I think, look, with all the advent of streaming services, right? You think maybe ESPN Plus or some other entity, but I want to go back to your comment about the National Soccer Hall of Fame, right? And having been the one in Oneonta and have not yet been to the new one. I also wonder, and I've said this on a couple of past episodes with some of our NASL guests. I wonder if the Major League Soccer's shall we say, significant investment in bringing it back to life. And ironically, the Hunt family, right, which was, the originator or progenitor of the old original North American Soccer League, right? With Lamar keeping the thing afloat, right? The idea of, right? So I can't imagine, there just seems to be sort of a convenient, ignorance, I guess, of sort of what happened in the past. And I don't understand why, an entity like that wouldn't want to take you up on that offer, because it's a treasure trove. You have essentially the video treasure trove of American soccer.
Well, thank you. Yeah, look, it's a mystery to me too. I mean, getting back to what I said earlier in the broadcast, look, people's tastes are different. There's some people who only care about what's happening right now. They don't care about what happened as recently as 10 minutes ago. Or certainly don't care about what happened 10 years ago or 30 years ago. There is a certain number of fans, so fortunately, like you and me, and others who do care about it and who like to relive those moments because it's fun to watch, and we have an emotional connection to sports from the past. Unfortunately, those people simply are not in position. The people like us are not in a position to put these games on the air. Not just ESPN Classic. I remember back when it was the Fox Sports World, before FS1 is the Fox Sports Channel, but before what was called FS1, what was it called? It was the
Fox Soccer Channel for a while there, right?
Fox Soccer Channel, right? And right, Fox Soccer Channel before Fox Soccer Channel was Fox Sports World. And again, I contacted the programming director of those channels, and the guy who ran the programming director at Fox Soccer Channel was a Australian man whose name again escapes me, who grew up watching First Division soccer in England on Australian TV, and so surprise, look at what. The only historic soccer that showed up on this Fox Soccer Channel was old videos of old English First Division games. That was, I remember 10 years ago watching, old games from the FA Cup in the 1970s on Fox Soccer Channel, because that's what he cared about. People see that's the way these things seem to go. People don't want to put on games that they didn't care about when they were young. They getting tripped up on my words here. They only want to put the games on that they cared about when they were young, not the games that they didn't care about, which is just the way it goes. Yeah.
So what's going to happen with your collection? Is it basically going to be there for any of the small handful of visitors that you may invite up to your place, or do you think there will be a place where it ultimately goes for more to enjoy, perhaps?
That all depends, I think, on the Soccer Hall of Fame. I mean, if the Soccer Hall of Fame cares enough to do something with my collection, then it will go there. If they don't care, then it's going to stay here. There's your answer. I don't see the point in sending the collection to the Hall of Fame if it's just going to gather dust in a closet somewhere in Frisco, Texas. That doesn't seem to me. That seems to be pointless. I mean, I've already provided the Hall of Fame with a bunch of DVDs that they use clips from those DVDs for some of the displays in the Hall of Fame. So some of my collection is in the Hall of Fame, small parts of it. Look, not just the Hall of Fame. I mean, the U.S. Soccer Federation suddenly decided that they wanted to have a huge historic presence on their website or on a separate website. I would give it to them. Again, I'm easy to reach. If any of these people have an idea for how to use the video archive in a productive manner that would let everybody watch the games, I'm happy to cooperate with these people. But so far, nobody has ever come to me with a proposal like that.
Well, this is hopefully a bit of an impetus to perhaps get some folks to do that, because I as I've been in this, a lot of our conversations have been oral history, and a lot of them, frankly, with direct participants in this, especially in the realm of soccer. We got a whole bunch coming up, and we've had Kyle Rode on, we've had Ricky Davis on. I mean, Clive Torrey. I mean, Bobby Moff. I mean, just great stories and memories and stuff. And it is a shame to let this history go forgotten, shall we say? And video is probably the thing that, most youngins today sort of understand, and on a phone in particular, right? They could get access at any time. I mean, I'm amazed, for example, I think there's an anecdote here with music, right? My two teenage daughters, my older teenage daughter in particular, amazes me every single day when she can tell me a song from like 1973, like an Elton John album cut. She knows the name of it. She knows sometimes the album of it. She can sing most of the lyrics to it. And it amazes me, like, how the hell do you know that? Right. And it's because, right, the ability on YouTube or Spotify, I mean, the catalog of right, which for many years, given media, and the limitations and the choices, right, you not having TNT, for example, back in the day, right, the ability to actually, in many respects, everything is almost available on demand, and it allows people, once they're interested, to go deep and really long into the rabbit holes that really interest them. And to me, that's fascinating. If I had that when I was growing up, I'd probably be a much more well-educated and well-rounded person, I guess. But I just think that today, as all this stuff becomes digitized and or available, how do you not make this stuff available so that people can, as they discover and become interested, they can go and sort of access this stuff? That to me feels valuable, especially with what you've got.
Look, I completely agree with you. The answer is that it's going to take time and money to upload all of the videos, thousands of DVDs. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of money to upload all of those to a streaming service, whether it's a Hall of Fame website or YouTube. And I'm sorry, but I've got a lot of other things going on in my life right now, and I don't want to sit there for, hours and hours and hours uploading all this stuff. If somebody else would like to do it, somebody else can do it. But I'm willing to cooperate. I'm sorry, but I'm not willing to spend all that time and effort doing it. Somebody else has to take the initiative. I've done my part. I've found the videos and I've archived them, and they're there. If somebody else needs to, what's a good sports analogy here? Somebody else needs to take the ball and cross the goal line with it.
Well, look, I think every American soccer fan of a certain generation owes you a huge debt of gratitude, and I think you're absolutely right, to the ability to take it to the next level. All right, so how can people then, if you don't have all your games and stuff listed anymore on your website and all that, how can people reach out to you? To either continue this conversation, find their own sort of desires, and maybe even order still a few, or maybe as our listening audience permeates, in the weeks and months as this episode gets out there, somebody who can actually maybe make some of what we've discussed actually happen.
Well, I'll give you my email address. It's Dave Brett. It's my first and middle names, DAVEBRETT, Dave Brett at austin.rr.com. And you can reach me there, and I'd be happy to talk with anybody who would like to talk about this. That seems to be the simplest way to reach me.
All right, and we're reluctant to, we're remiss to not ask you, what is your day job? What have you moved on to in life besides this ultimate passion, right? Which I can't imagine there would be anything else in one's lifetime that would be more important than this.
Actually, strangely enough, there is something in my life that's more important than soccer and sports. I am an animal rights activist. I am a vegan. I think that what our society does to animals is absolutely horrible. And factory farms are a disgrace. And I have created a new nonprofit animal rights organization called Cruelty-Free Investing. The genesis of this project was that I went to my financial advisor and told him that I wanted to avoid investing in stocks which exploit animals. And he said, great, give me a list of all the stocks that do that. And every time I buy stock for your account, I'll avoid buying one of those companies. And I went online and was startled to find that no such list existed. So I created a nonprofit organization. We went through every company on every major stock exchange, and we've now categorized them as companies which do or do not exploit animals. And if you go to our website, it's crueltyfreeinvesting.org, and you can click on the name of a company and see how that company uses animals. And if this is something you care about, and I hope that people do care, you can avoid investing in those companies. That's been, my passion in life. I'm a big PETA supporter. I'm a big supporter of a group called Mercy for Animals. And, and by the way, I was pleased to learn that once saw a list of soccer players who are vegan, like guys like Dwayne Rosario is a vegan. He doesn't talk about it very much, but I was pleased to see that I'm not the only soccer fan and who cares about this. That's been where my life has been headed over the last few years.
No, I think that's
through this animal rights group.
And where can people find out more about that? Did you give the website again?
It's cruelty-free investing.org. And you could also if you want to contact me you can contact me through that site as well. That would be, and I'm happy to talk about soccer with anybody. Well, look,
I appreciate your talking with me about this, because I saw the great article that Pablo Amaro did for The Athletic a couple of weeks back. The Austin local paper did something, obviously, in and around the relaunch of the National Soccer Hall of Fame, and having seen the name and written more than a fair share of checks over the years. And now having this podcast, I figured, there's an opportunity here and a perfect excuse to have a conversation. So on behalf of all this,
I feel guilty for having charged you. From now on, you're going to get DVDs for free. Well, you want a game from me, you don't have to pay me.
Well, that you heard it here first, folks, and for our thousands, I guess, now of listeners, we appreciate that. I don't know if Dave will extend the same benefit to our listeners, but
no, I can't afford to send it to everybody else, because then I would get besieged with requests for DVDs, which I do not have time to make.
Yeah. Well, look, I thank you. I guess in a sort of odd way, I do thank you for your commitment to what I think, frankly, is a very essential piece of American soccer history, and I hope what you have suggested does materialize, right? I mean, if there are repositories or places like the newly refurbished and newly alive Soccer Hall of Fame, I mean, what better place? And I'm ignorant of the politics. I think I'm aware of some of the possible sort of feelings and or desire to sort of avoid being connoted with quote unquote failure or whatever. But again, this is all part of history. And by the way, there is a soccer history that even predates the North American Soccer League, but that's, for another time,
sure.
right? So if that's going to be embraced in this Soccer Hall of Fame, why wouldn't arguably the most successful attempt at professional soccer before Major League Soccer, why wouldn't that at least be remembered as the building blocks by which we enjoy a very robust and hopefully successful going forward professional league?
You're not going to get any argument from me on that one. I agree with you.
All right, interesting conversation for sure, and a situation that you heard there that needs to be addressed, don't you think? The idea that the most deep and historically solid trove of North American Soccer League video game footage is sitting in someone's personal collection in his home, and not in a place, let's say, like the National Soccer Hall of Fame, where it ought to be and shared and celebrated is kind of beyond me. And I think, frankly, it's even beyond Dave's comprehension, too. It's a head scratcher, but it's also an amazing testament to Dave's personal passion and interest in keeping the history of the North American Soccer League alive. I think there's probably some other footage out there that will surprise us over time, that will sort of find its way out there into the world. And I hope that it could be joined by the rich array of stuff that Dave has compiled, and preferably in a sort of professional environment where all of us as soccer fans can enjoy it. Hopefully maybe this little conversation will spur some interest a little bit further to do so. Now, you heard Dave has essentially kind of turned off his website and the list of all the great games and stuff that he has access to. Certainly, there are a number of games available out there on YouTube, and more sort of being joined with them, by the week, it seems. But Dave's email address, if you want to contact him, if there's a game you're looking for, or perhaps there's someone out there who can maybe figure out some ways here by which we can get all of this footage sort of out there and digitized and shared, whether it's under the auspices of a Hall of Fame or some other mechanism, some other mannerism, whether that be an ESPN Classic or one of these dozens of streaming video services are out there. I mean, there's maybe it's professionally curated on YouTube somewhere where we can get this stuff out of Dave's home, for God's sake, and out there into the world, so all of us and more of us can enjoy it. Dave's email address is Dave Brett. That's DaveBrett. Dave Brett, all one word, at austin.rr.com. That's Dave Brett at austin.rr.com. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you, especially if you've got some soccer memories and whatnot, and again, especially if you think you've got some kind of inroads to perhaps on how we can figure out a way to get all this great videotape digitized and out there into the world. He and I, and I'm sure a whole bunch of other soccer fans out there would love to sort of make that kind of stuff happen. Again, that's Dave Brett at austin.rr.com. And if you forget any of that stuff or you want some more information, and we'll probably have a couple of other things out there on our website for this episode, just look it up at goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's the place not only to find this episode, but all of our past episodes, all of our social feeds at Twitter. You'll find us at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on the Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on Facebook. We've got a little page devoted to our show there. You can send us email. You can click from the website, or you can just send it to us directly at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. There's a whole bunch of different ways to reach us. We'd love to hear from you, and please, by all means, do so What else? Oh, I wanted to tell you quickly, the clip that you heard at the beginning of the show was actually the first ever video that I bought from Dave, for God's sakes. It was September? No, it was July 5th. Yeah, 1975. It was one of the first games that Pelé played for the New York Kosmos. It was a game against the Seattle Sounders that you heard, and Frank Gleber calling the action for CBS. And I thought it was a little great way to sort of set up the show. So there's an example of some of the great video that Dave has, and there's tons of it. Let's see if we can get that out there into the world, shall we? And before we go and send you off into the world to continue on your day or your journeys or whatever else you're doing in your life, we want to say one last bit of thanks to our friends, as always, at Podfly Productions, and in particular, Mr. or Dr., shall we say, Jerry Payne, who helps us put all of our collective pieces together and makes this show sound somewhat comprehensible each and every week. We thank him and Podfly Productions. You can find more about them at podfly.net. All right, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. Many great stories and episodes to come your way. We appreciate your listening, and we'll see you next week. Until then, take care.